Hello again from Metro Manila, the Philippines, Southeastern Asia. I think it was earlier this week that the United States House of Representatives passed a resolution apologizing or expressing sympathy for the victims of the Armenian genocide, and then Turkey, unfortunately and totally inappropriately, retaliated by recalling its ambassador or by summoning the US ambassador to Turkey for heated discussion. It would be time, especially since over a century has passed since the Armenian genocide, for Turkey to finally agree that it was a gross violation of human rights, which Turkey, still at that time called the Ottoman Empire, should profoundly apologize for and even compensate Armenia for, and the descendants of those victims. This was not the first time, because in 1896 there had been a smaller genocide perpetrated by Turkey against Armenians, recalled by the late Mrs. Pearl, or originally Henazant Kashishian, in her biography, The Flight of the Bride, published by or written by Donita Dyer, which my dear late mother read to me and my brother in the nighttime in the early 1980s. And I then, quite many times after that, flipped through the book. Mrs. Kashishian was lucky enough to immigrate to the United States before the big Armenian genocide started. Unfortunately, her mother died when trying to flee from the Turks, the Ottoman Turks. Okay, so let's read about this genocide on Wikipedia. And Mrs. Kashishian became an evangelical Christian, and then gave to Donita Dyer the right to share her story. Before the book was published, Mrs. Kashishian died in her 90s in 1977. So the Armenian genocide, also known as the Armenian Holocaust, was the mass systematic extermination and expulsion of 1.5 million ethnic Armenians within the Ottoman Empire, and most of them even were Ottoman citizens, which began approximately in 1914, so around the time when the First World War started, and then lasted until 1923, when the Ottoman Empire finally had disintegrated and was replaced by either self-governing countries or territories in the Middle East, or then by the Turkish Empire. By the Turkish Republic. Türkiye Cumhuriyeti. Armenia is an independent republic in the Caucasus region, which is one of the conventional borderlines between Asia and Europe, by the way. This genocide's conventional starting date was April the 24th, 1915, the day when the Ottoman authorities rounded up, arrested, and deported from Constantinople, the empire's capital, now called Istanbul, to the region of Angora, now Ankara, and Ankara is now Turkey's capital. Between 235 and 270 Armenian intellectuals and community leaders, the majority of whom were eventually murdered. I actually once, several years ago, in the academic bookstore of the center of Helsinki in Finland, flipped through a book about the Armenian genocide. And was it so that there was a macabre series of photographs of the severed heads of these intellectuals? I didn't buy that book, needless to say. The genocide was carried out during and after World War I and implemented in two phases. First, the wholesale killing of the able-bodied male population through massacre, and subjection of army conscripts to forced labor, followed by the deportation of women, children, the elderly, and the infirm on death marches leading to the Syrian desert. Driven forward by military escorts, the deportees were deprived of food and water and subjected to periodic robbery, rape, and massacre. Most Armenian diaspora communities around the world came into being as a direct result of the genocide. Other ethnic groups were similarly targeted for extermination in the Assyrian genocide and the Greek genocide, and their treatment is considered by some historians to be part of the same genocidal policy. Raphael Lemkin was moved specifically by the annihilation of the Armenians to define systematic and premeditated exterminations within legal parameters and to coin the word genocide in 1943. It is now acknowledged to have been one of the first modern genocides. Of course, it pales in comparison with the Jewish or anti-Semitic Holocaust during the Second World War, in which an estimated 6 million Jews were killed, alongside then something like 11 million people from other nationalities, especially Russians, Poles, Yugoslavs, and Romanis or Gypsies. And then there were helpers of Jews, so-called righteous among the Gentiles, thousands of whom were also killed. The Armenian genocide was perpetrated in an organized manner, and it is the second most studied case of genocide after the Holocaust. Turkey denies that the word genocide is an accurate term for these crimes, and it is wrong. But in recent years has been faced with increasing calls to recognize them as such. As of 2019, governments and parliaments of 31 countries, including Brazil, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, and Russia, as well as 49 of the 50 US states, have recognized the events as a genocide. The western portion of historical Armenia, known as Western Armenia, had come under Ottoman jurisdiction by the Treaty of Amasya in 1555, and was permanently divided from Eastern Armenia by the Treaty of Zuhab in 1639. The vast majority of Armenians were grouped together into a semi-autonomous community the Armenian millet, which was led by one of the spiritual heads of the Armenian Apostolic Church. It's a Christian denomination similar to the Greek, Russian, and Eastern Orthodox churches. The Armenian Patriarch of Constantinople. Armenians lived mainly in the eastern provinces of the Ottoman Empire, although large communities were found also in the empire's western provinces. And even in the capital, Constantinople. The Armenian community was made up of three religious denominations: Armenian Catholic, Armenian Protestant, and then the vastly most popular denomination, the Armenian Apostolic Church. Under the Millet system, the Armenian community was allowed to rule itself under its own system of governance with fairly little interference from the Ottoman government. And there was such a system for example, Greeks, Bulgarians, Serbs, Albanians, and various other even Jews. So in that sense, the Ottoman Empire was a somewhat decentralized empire, although of course the Sultan or the Emperor officially held the supreme and even absolute power. Approximately 70% of Armenians lived in poor and dangerous conditions in the rural countryside, with the exception of the wealthy, Constantinople-based Amira class, a social elite whose members include the Duzians, or directors of the imperial mint, or money printing and coin-making company. The Balyans, or chief imperial architects, and the Dadians, or superintendent of the gunpowder mills and manager of industrial factories. The Ottoman census figures and the statistics collected by the Armenian Patriarchate conflicted with each other concerning the numbers of Armenians, but according to the Armenian Patriarchate's statistics, there were almost 3 million Armenians living in the empire in 1878. Of them, 1.3 million in Western Armenia, 670,000 in Lesser Armenia and the area around Kayseri, 600,000 in Asia Minor and Cilicia, and 400,000 in Constantinople and the Balkans. In the eastern provinces, the Armenians were frequently discriminated against by Turks and Kurds through overtaxing, brigandage and kidnapping, forcible conversions to Islam, and other exploitations. The central and local authorities usually looked aside. In addition to other legal limitations, Christians, such as those Armenians who identified as Orthodox or Catholics or Protestants, were not considered equals to Muslims, and several prohibitions were placed on them. Testimony against Muslims by Christians and Jews was inadmissible in courts of law where a Muslim could be punished. In other words, their testimony could only be considered in commercial cases. They could not carry weapons or ride on top of horses and camels. Their horses could not be higher than those of Muslims. And while they were allowed to practice their religion, they could not ring church bells in order to summon the faithful to the church services. In the mid-19th century, the three major European powers, Britain, France, and Russia, started to question the Ottoman Empire's treatment of its Christian minorities and pressure it to grant equal rights to all of its subjects. Between 1839 and 1876, the Ottoman Empire instituted the Tanzimat, a series of reforms designed to improve the minorities' status. However, most of the reforms were never implemented because the empire's Muslim population rejected the principle of equality for Christians. By the late 1870s, however, the European Greeks had managed to become independent. The Armenians remained by and large passive during these years, earning them the title of Millet-i-Sadika, or the loyal millet. In the mid-1860s and early 1870s, this passivity gave way to new currents of thinking in Armenian society. Educated Armenians who had studied at European universities or American missionary schools in Turkey, or what is now known as Turkey, began to question their second-class status and press for better treatment from their government. In one such instance, after amassing the signatures of peasants from Western Armenia, the Armenian Communal Council petitioned the Ottoman government to redress their principal grievances. The Ottoman government considered those grievances and promised to punish those responsible for them, meaning Muslim Kurds and Circassians, but no meaningful steps to do so were ever taken. The war between Russia and the Ottoman Empire in 1877 and 1878 ended with Russia's decisive victory, and its army occupied large parts of eastern Turkey. Bulgaria was granted self-government, but not before entire Armenian districts had been devastated by massacres carried out with the connivance or active participation of Ottoman authorities. In the Treaty of Berlin in 1878, no effective clauses were prepared to protect the Armenians from Ottoman exploitation. In the last quarter of the 19th century, the Armenian nationalist movement came to be dominated by three parties: the Armenakan, whose influence was limited to Van, a large city in what is now eastern Turkey; the Social Democratic Hunchakian Party; and the Armenian Revolutionary Federation, or Dashnak Tsutiun. Despite their ideological differences, all of them tried to achieve better social conditions for the Armenians of the Ottoman Empire through self-defense. Sultan Abdul Hamid II, who ruled from 1876 to 1909, attempted to forestall the implementation of the Treaty of Berlin, even though the reform provisions in that treaty were feeble, by asserting that Armenians did not make up a majority in the provinces and that their reports of abuses were largely exaggerated or false. In 1890, Abdul Hamid created a paramilitary outfit known as the Hamidiye, which was mostly made up of Kurdish irregulars, tasked to deal with the Armenians as they wished. As Ottoman officials intentionally provoked rebellions, often as a result of overtaxation, in Armenian populated towns such as in Sasun in 1894 and in Zeytun in 1895 to 96, those regiments were increasingly used to deal with the Armenians by way of oppression and massacre. On October the 1st, 1895, 2,000 Armenians assembled in Constantinople to petition for the reform's implementation, but Ottoman police units violently broke up the rally. Soon, massacres of Armenians broke out in Constantinople and then engulfed the rest of the Armenian populated provinces of Bitlis, Diyarbakir, Erzurum, Harput, Sivas, Trabzon, and Van. Between 100,000 and 300,000 Armenians were killed in those massacres. On July the 24th, 1908, the Armenians' hopes for equality in the Ottoman Empire brightened when a coup d'etat staged by officers in the Ottoman Third Army, based in Salonika, now Thessaloniki, in northern Greece, removed Abdul Hamid II from power and restored the Ottoman Empire to a constitutional monarchy. The officers were part of the Young Turk movement that wanted to reform administration of the perceived decadent state of the Ottoman Empire and modernize it to European standards. It was an anti-Hamidian coalition made up of two distinct groups, the liberal constitutionalists and the nationalists. The former were more democratic and accepting of Armenians, while the latter were less tolerant of Armenians and their frequent requests for European assistance. A counter-coup took place in early 1909 and unfortunately resulted in the Adana massacre on April the 13th, 1909. About 4,000 Turkish civilians and soldiers participated in the rampage, or it began on that day anyway, and between 15,000 and 30,000 Armenians were killed. In 1912, the First Balkan War broke out and ended with the defeat of the Ottoman Empire. It lost 85% of its European territory. The Turkish nationalist movement in the Ottoman Empire gradually came to view Anatolia as their last refuge. And there, the Armenian population formed a significant minority. On November the 2nd, 1914, the Ottoman Empire declared war on the Entente powers and joined the Central Powers alongside Germany and Austria-Hungary. Italy had declared its neutrality in August 1914 and would switch sides in 1915. On December the 24th, 1914, Minister of War of the Ottoman Empire Enver Pasha implemented a plan to encircle and destroy the Russian Caucasus army at Sarikamish to regain territories lost to Russia after the war between Russia and the Ottoman Empire in 1877 and 78. Enver Pasha's forces were routed in the battle and almost completely destroyed. In November 1914, Shaykh ul-Islam proclaimed jihad, or holy war, against the Christians, and this was later used as a factor to provoke radical masses in the implementation of the Armenian genocide. On February the 25th, 1915, the Ottoman General Staff released the War Minister Enver Pasha's Directive 8682 on increased security and precautions to all military units, calling for the removal of all ethnic Armenians serving in the Ottoman forces from their positions and for their demobilization. On April the 19th, 1915, Jevdet Bey demanded that the city of Van immediately furnish him 4,000 soldiers under the pretext of conscription. However, the local Armenians realized that his goal was to massacre the able-bodied men of Van so that there would be no defenders. The Armenians offered 500 soldiers and exemption money for the rest in order to buy time, but Jevdet Bey accused the Armenians of rebellion and asserted his determination to crush it at any cost. On April the 20th, 1915, the siege of Van began when an Armenian woman was harassed, and the 2 Armenian men who came to her aid were killed by Ottoman soldiers. By 1914, Ottoman authorities had already begun a propaganda drive to present Armenians living in the Ottoman Empire as a threat to the empire's security. In May 1915, Mehmet Talat Pasha requested that the cabinet and Grand Vizier Said Halim Pasha legalize a measure for the deportation of Armenians to other places due to what Talat Pasha called the Armenian riots and massacres which had arisen in a number of places in the country. On May the 29th, 1915, the CUP Central Committee passed the temporary law of deportation, or Tehjir law, giving the Ottoman government and military authorization to deport anyone it sensed as a threat to national security. The Armenians were marched out to the Syrian town of Deir ez-Zor and the surrounding desert. The Ottoman government deliberately withheld the facilities and supplies that would have been necessary to sustain the life of hundreds of thousands of Armenian deportees during and after their forced march to the Syrian desert. Rape was an integral part of the genocide. Military commanders told their men to do to the women whatever you wish, resulting in widespread sexual abuse. A network of 25 concentration camps was set up by the Ottoman government to dispose of the Armenians who had survived the deportations to their ultimate point. The Committee of Union and Progress founded the special organization in Turkish Teşkilat-i Mahsusa that participated in the destruction of the Ottoman Armenian community. This organization adopted its name in 1913 and functioned like a special forces outfit, and it has been compared by some scholars to the Nazi Einsatzgruppen. Eitan Belkind was a Nili member who infiltrated the Ottoman army as an official. He was assigned to the headquarters of Kemal Pasha. He witnessed how 5,000 Armenians were burned. Trebizond, now Trabzon, was the main city in Trebizond Vilayet. Oscar S. Heiser or Heitzer, the American consul at Trebizond, reported, "This plan did not suit Nile Bay. Many of the children were loaded into boats and taken out to sea and thrown overboard." Ottoman physicians contributed to the planning and execution of the genocide. The physicians Behaeddin Shakir and Nazim Bey were leading figures in the leadership committee of the Committee of Union and Progress, and both held leadership roles in the special organization. Other physicians used their medical expertise to facilitate the killings, including designing methods for poisoning victims and using Armenians as subjects for lethal human experimentation. Specific medical methods used to kill methods included morphine overdose, toxic gas, typhoid inoculation, On September the 13th, 1915, the Ottoman Parliament passed the temporary law of expropriation and confiscation, stating that all property, including land, livestock, and homes belonging to Armenians, was to be confiscated by the authorities. During the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, the Armenian delegation presented an assessment of 3.7 billion US dollars, worth about 53 billion US dollars today, worth of material losses owned solely by the Armenian Church. By the early 1930s, all properties belonging to Armenians who were subject to deportation had been confiscated. On the night of November the 2nd to 3rd, 1918, and with the aid of Ahmed Izzet Pasha, the three Pashas, who included Mehmet Talat Pasha and Ismail Enver Pasha, the genocide's main perpetrators, fled the Ottoman Empire. In 1919, after the Mudros armistice, Sultan Mehmed VI was ordered to organize courts-martial by the Allied administration in charge of Constantinople to try members of the Committee of Union and Progress for taking the Ottoman Empire into World War I. By January 1919, a report to Sultan Mehmed VI accused over 130 suspects, most of whom were high officials. On July the 11th, 1919, Damat Ferid Pasha officially confessed that he had participated in massacres against the Armenians in the Ottoman Empire. He was a key figure and initiator of the war crime trials held directly after World War I to condemn to death the genocide's chief perpetrators. After the pronouncement, the three Pashas were sentenced to death in absentia at the trials in Constantinople. The courts-martial were dismissed in August 1920 for their lack of transparency, according to the then High Commissioner Admiral Sir John de Robeck, and some of the accused were transported to Malta for further interrogation, only to be released afterwards in an exchange of prisoners of war. Two of the three Pashas were later assassinated by Armenian vigilantes during Operation Nemesis. The American Committee for Armenian and Syrian Relief, established in 1915, just after the deportations began, was a charitable organization established to relieve the suffering of the Near East's peoples. The organization was championed by American Ambassador Henry Morgenthau Sr. Morgenthau's dispatches or written reports on the mass slaughter of Armenians galvanized much support for the organization. In its first year, the ACRNE cared for 132,000 Armenian orphans from Tiflis, Yerevan. Tiflis is now called Tbilisi and is Georgia's capital. Yerevan is Armenia's capital. Constantinople, now Istanbul, the former Ottoman capital. Sivas, Beirut, Lebanon's capital, Damascus, Syria's capital, and Jerusalem, Israel's capital. A relief organization for refugees in the Middle East helped donate over 102 million US dollars, according to the 1930 value, to Armenians both during and after the war. Between 1915 and 1930, ACRNE distributed humanitarian relief to locations across a wide geographical range, eventually spending over 10 times its original estimate and helping around 2 million refugees. Many Western historians, or most Western historians, estimate that over 800,000 Armenians died between 1914 and 1918. Estimates vary between 800,000 and 1.5 million, according to the governments of France, Canada, and other states. An eminent British historian, Arnold J. Toynbee, who was then working as an intelligence officer of the British Foreign Office, or Foreign Ministry, estimated that 600,000 Armenians died or were massacred during deportation in a report compiled on May the 24th, 1916. However, this figure only accounted for the first year of the genocide and did not take into account those who died or were killed after May 1916. According to documents that once belonged to Talat Pasha, over 970,000 Ottoman Armenians disappeared from official population records from 1915 to 1916. Hundreds of eyewitnesses, including diplomats from the neutral United States, the United States only joined the First World War officially in April 1917, and the Ottoman Empire's own allies, Germany and Austria-Hungary, recorded and documented numerous acts of state-sponsored massacres. Many foreign officials offered to intervene on behalf of the Armenians, including Pope Benedict XV, only to be turned away by Ottoman government officials who claimed they were retaliating against a pro-Russian insurrection. And then, to prevent this from running too long, as a response to continuing denial by the Turkish state, which is very sad, many activists from Armenian diaspora communities have pushed for formal recognition of the Armenian genocide from various governments around the world. According to Kemal Çiçek, the head of the Armenian research group at the Turkish Historical Institute, in Turkey there is no official thesis on the Armenian issue. Formally, the Republic of Turkey claims that the deaths of Armenians during the relocation or deportation cannot aptly be deemed genocide, which is, of course, flat wrong. A position that has been supported with a plethora of diverging justifications, that the killings were not deliberate or systematically orchestrated, that the killings were justified because Armenians posed a Russian sympathizing threat as a cultural group, that the Armenians merely starved to death, or any of various characterizations referring to marauding Armenian gangs. Volkan Vural, retired ambassador of Turkey to Germany and Spain, says, and rightly so, that the Turkish state should apologize for what happened to the Armenians during the deportations of 1915 and what happened to the Greeks during the Istanbul pogrom. He also states, I think that the Armenian issue can be solved by politicians and not by historians. I don't believe that historical facts about this issue are not revealed. The historical facts are already known. The most important point here is that how these facts will be interpreted and will affect the future. Let's see. The historian Alfred de Zayat has stated that because of the continuing character of the crime of genocide in factual and legal terms, the remedy of restitution has not been foreclosed. Thus, the survivors of the genocide against the Armenians, both individually and collectively, have standing to advance a claim for restitution. Whenever possible, complete restitution or restoration to the previous condition should be granted. Where it is not possible, relevant compensation may be substituted as a remedy. De Zaya also states that genocides are considered delicta juris gentium, crimes in addition to being a crime against humanity. Therefore, statutes of limitation do not apply. In other words, these crimes will never become technically outdated. And the Turkish state is still criminally liable for the genocide and is legally obligated to provide reparations for the victims. And I certainly agree.